Hi, everyone. So I'm Cheryl Chung from the Kuan School of Public Policy, and so delighted to be here, even on this virtual platform. Quite a new experience for all of us. So wanted to just come and share a little bit about futures thinking and some perspectives, I guess, from the world of education. So for myself, I started off as a civil servant, specializing in strategic foresight for government, and then now looking at doing that within the education sector. So the Kuan School is a graduate public policy school, but like many education institutions around the world, we've been kind of pivoting to online. So I titled this presentation, What Can We Teach the Next Generation? And as Jackie mentioned, trying to also maybe take a little bit of a step back in this, I would say, very unprecedented time, and in many cases, very confusing and very uncertain time for a lot of us. But I think as an educator, I've been thinking a lot about how if I feel anxious and uncertain, then what does the next generation feel, right? It must be quite challenging. So one of the first things I've been really thinking about, and I know we're here talking about technology and education, but as the first speaker, I wanted to also share a little bit more about this question. If technology was the answer, actually, what's the question in education that we are trying to ask? And I think that that's something that we should be really thinking about in this time before we kind of rush into 101 exciting technology solutions. Really trying to think about what is it that we are trying to equip the next generation for. And for myself, as somebody with a kind of futures thinking background, I think one question that's been quite interesting, and I thought about this very much when I read about the Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg, and she had this news conference addressing children's questions, right? So children had questions around like, are we going to be going to kindergarten? Can we still visit our grandparents? These kinds of questions. And one of the things that she said, which was really lovely, was, it's okay to, be scared when there's so many things going on, but we need to be brave, right? And I feel like when I start thinking about this next generation and the generation of young people who we're educating at this time, I feel like this generation is staring down the barrel of a gun, right? They are a generation that is going to be looking at challenges of climate change, of inequality, of the after effects of COVID that might last for years and years, and there is, in my view, a narrowing window to actually try to help them, try to make sense and sense make this very uncertain future. So if it's okay to be scared, but we need to be brave, then what kind of tools do we have to be able to do so? And this is where I think futures thinking comes in. And for me, futures thinking in its simplest form is really an exercise of what if thinking, right? It's trying to engage the imagination and entertain multiple possibilities, to try to sense make very a great deal of maybe uncertain trends, and then try to think about what are alternative scenarios that might be happening in the future. So maybe what I will do for the rest of the presentation is tell you 3 stories of how I think futures thinking might help in this current context, and think a little bit and reflect and help to set a context for the rest of our event here, about what are the questions that we are trying to ask and how is technology going to solve some of these questions. So the first example I have is with a local junior college here in Singapore. And I've been working with them to teach an extracurricular futures program, right? So this program, as many of these programs go, essentially is trying to help young people, kind of turn young people into model citizens, right? Kind of teach them some new tools, and for 8 to 10 weeks, they gather trends that might affect the future of Singapore. So for the very first session that I did, this is a photo from last year's batch, but for the very first session I did, we played a game called the Pollock game. And in this game, you kind of map yourself in a physical space. Of course, you could do this in a digital space as well, according to whether or not you were optimistic or pessimistic about the future, or whether you thought you had high agency or low agency. So the students will kind of cluster themselves into these various quadrants. And then we all get into this discussion about why are you in this quadrant? What does it mean to you? Why have you chosen this particular space to be in? And for me, it was very interesting to see that many young people actually find themselves or plant themselves in this low agency quadrant, right? This quadrant that actually says, I don't have a lot of control over my future. And one question that I then talked to the deputy principal about after that was, let's reflect on that a little bit. And he made this very interesting observation, is that actually what happens is that even for the top performers in some of our best schools, their vision of their own future is so single and singular that anything other than that is considered failure. We all know that life is much, much more complex and much more messy than that. And there could be actually many, many futures in which you may be a happy, thriving, successful citizen, and actually live a very happy and fulfilled life, right? But I think we don't necessarily teach our students that, and we don't teach them and give them the tools, to actually see the future as a world of possibility that they have agency and control over. So one question that I have in my head about technology in this case is really, does going online make this kind of issue better or worse? Does it just become an intermediated box, where you just download information to students? Or does it become a platform that really engages them, personalizes, what they're learning to really give them agency and excitement about what their future could look like? So that's the first story and some reflections of what I think the questions around tech might be. The second story is about futures as a safe space. So this particular set of photos is from a workshop that I ran end of last year. And in this workshop, we brought together about 75 young people from all over Asia. And, we basically put this thought experiment to them. And the thought experiment was, can we design public services for Mars? So is the question, are we going to Mars today? Then the answer is probably not, right? But the point of the exercise is to have a safe space to challenge the assumptions about what public services could look like, who might provide them, what does that provision look like, and what if we had the chance to redesign some of these systems and so on. So for many of these students, it was their first exposure to both public policy as well as futures thinking. And it was a very interesting exercise to create this, I would say, safe space or bubble even, to kind of ask questions that almost seem slightly ridiculous, right? And the middle photo is something that I wanted to point out, because during our workshop, one of the scenarios was actually this question of how did we end up in Mars in the first place, right? And the students said, we ended up in Mars because there was a widespread disease. And the government started to give universal access to a vaccine to cure the widespread disease. But what ended up happening was that it turned out to be a population control measure. And the political backlash from this, this action was so severe that a new political party rose up and promising to lead a new life on Mars. And this is how the human race ended up on Mars. So, in November 2019, this teenager sitting on the floor covered in sticky dots, it's quite amusing, right? And so it seems, it's quite funny, right? And the idea seems kind of remote. But even less than, 2 or 3 months later, the idea doesn't seem so crazy anymore. And this idea of being able to dress rehearse the future, I think is such an important one, right? So again, how do we use our online tools, to also create safe spaces, right? I mean, I think the issue of anonymity within the digital space and for young people, things like cyberbullying and all that kind of stuff, also happens on the online realm. And I think one question that I ask is really, how can we, even when designing these new online education systems, also create this safe space of not just keeping our children safe, and our young people safe, but also keeping a safe space of being expansive in the way that we look at the world, right? And thinking about the world in different ways. So the third story I wanted to share segues from this second story. So we had the wonderful opportunity for this particular workshop to visit the Art Science Museum. And they have a wonderful exhibition going on now, which is called 2219. And the idea is to think about Singapore and its climate change futures in the 200-year time frame. So we were lucky to be there on opening night, and a lot of the feedback from the students was around, they were so interested in these like physical and tangible depictions of what the future looked like. So one interesting depiction was this one. And in this example, a group called Superclass, they essentially mocked up a housing development board flat. And they talked about it as what happens to Singapore if sea levels rise and your void deck is full of water, and you look outside the window, there's not roads, but somebody is in their canoe going from block to block, that kind of thing, and you don't have stable access to food, so you got to grow microgreens in your apartment and all that kind of stuff. So they mocked up the inside of a flat, to this kind of climate change scenario for the future. And for me, this was a very interesting example because, again, it talks a lot about, before we even talk about online or offline, I think there's a conversation that we need to have about outer world and inner world, right? And the power of imagination here that really leads to this ability to prepare for the future, right? I think that this is something that humans have the ability to do, right? To imagine things that are not there, or have not come to pass. And even in an online space, it's not just about these physical depictions like what Superflux has done for this HTV flat mock-up, but it's also harnessing our own inner worlds, right? And our own creativity and imagination to be able to construct, not just online, but also in our own heads and in our own imagination, this question of what if and what does the future look like? So these are some of the things that I've been thinking a little bit about during COVID. And maybe just to kind of close off, when the COVID kind of, I suppose the media started to kind of pick up the issue. And one of the things that I found very frustrating was, young people going out to party during spring break, during the middle of a global flu pandemic, and then of course a bunch of them caught COVID, and I found myself as an educator getting very irritated and very angry at this kind of behavior, right? But in a more compassionate moment, I really asked myself, do they behave in this way because they fundamentally do not think that they have agency over their future, right? That they're so overwhelmed at the kind of problems that the next generation has to solve, that it's like eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, And is that kind of attitude, something that us as educators have a responsibility to address, right? If blind optimism and dumb hope is not a strategy, then perhaps thinking through, what are some of these other tools that we might have available, whether they're online or offline, whether they're futures thinking or something else, to help the next generation both think as well as act on their future. And I do hope that for the rest of the time that we spend together, at this particular event, that we'll have the opportunity to exchange some of these ideas, right, about what the future of education also looks like, and really reflect, how can we help young people go into this uncertain and in many cases anxiety-inducing future in a much more, I would say, positive and high agency, and much more control over what they feel that their future will hold, and that they can see themselves thriving and being successful in that future as well. So thank you very much.